Yeah, hi everybody. Welcome to lesson number one of the Launch School JavaScript Prep webinar series. So, for those of you who are new to this, these webinars are a standalone type of webinar. Each lesson is its own component, so it doesn't require you to attend a previous one to understand any other lesson. However, they're definitely the most applicable if you are in the process of going through the Launch School Prep course. My name is Grace. I'm a TA here at Launch School. But just like the other TAs, I'm also a student in the Launch School core curriculum myself. So I've also been through the prep course. I've also been in the same shoes as you are now, coming into Launch School and this idea of mastery. And I've also been completely new to the material before. It's a hard process, kind of starting from scratch and feeling like you're overwhelmed with a lot of information. So I've totally been there. So I'm hoping this can feel like a safe space for everyone to learn, but also especially to make mistakes and to ask questions, right? So remember that we don't have any dumb questions here. Like all questions are welcome. The only thing I ask is that you use the Q&A feature that Zoom has rather than the chat, since it allows me to keep track of the questions that need to be answered and have already been answered. The chat is more for idle conversation and comments, and the occasional joke if you'd like. So if you put a question there, it might get lost. You're highly encouraged to code along and try out the examples that I'll be showing, as well as playing around on your own to experiment with different results. But if at any time you're feeling overwhelmed or feel like you're falling behind, try not to worry too much about it and just feel free to watch along them instead of trying to code along as well. And that's because all the material in today's session isn't anything that's not covered in the Launch School's Introduction to JavaScript book, which is available regardless of whether or not you're enrolled into the course. So I simply took that exact same book and I created this lesson plan out of it. There's nothing new or there's nothing that's hidden away that you're going to miss if you miss it here. This is just really an opportunity to make the learning experience a more interactive one than a solitary one that's kind of what you go through Launch School. You're kind of reading the material on your own and you're kind of isolated in that way. But this way we can kind of learn together and build a little bit of community and engage with each other. So I'm using Amazon Web Services Cloud 9, as you can see here, and it's what we recommend for those starting out, but you can use whatever coding environment that works for you. So make sure you just simply have access to this terminal or a terminal with Node installed. And for those of you joining for the first time and you just started using Cloud9, don't worry about it. Like it already comes installed with Node. So your screen should look something similar to mine. So as I disclosed in the chat, so it's currently 9:05 a.m. for me. I'm usually based in Toronto, Canada, Eastern Standard Time Zone, but I'm currently visiting Seoul, South Korea, so I'm 14 hours ahead. So I'd also be interested to see where everyone is tuning in from today. So if you'd like to drop where you are based in and what time it is for you right now in the chat. New York City, Connecticut. Ooh, 3 a.m. I'm sorry. Almost everyone else is in Eastern Time Zone. Cool, cool. Wow, EST comes together. Everybody's in EST. Almost. Okay, well, thank you so much for tuning in despite it being 3 in the morning. Okay, that's awesome. Glad to see so many people in all different walks of life tuning in. I suppose we can, yeah, let's talk a little bit about what we'll be covering today. So today we'll be covering data types, right? Which are the essential building blocks that we'll need to understand in order to begin programming, right? So we'll be looking at and manipulating values by performing different operations, and we do that using operators. We'll take a brief look over some more complex data types, such as arrays and objects, and how to access the values in each. From the past times I've done this, we usually don't have enough time to get to variables, but if we do, and because I want to make sure there's enough time for questions as well, we might be able to touch on variables a little bit. And if we have even more time, we can talk about the difference between the output of code versus the return value of code, which is also a really crucial concept to understand. Let's get started. All right, so data types. Okay, so for data types, a core aspect of programming is dealing with different types of data, right? And the reason why we differentiate between different data types is because it allows us to determine what we can and cannot do with a specific piece of data, right? So if we think about in a context outside of programming, just in real life, if we're talking about words versus numbers, there's some things that we can do with words, like we can spell out words, we can define words, we use words in communication. Whereas, with numbers, we don't really necessarily communicate with numbers, or we can do some operations with numbers that we can't do with words. It's like a very similar thing in programming as well. So JavaScript has actually two distinct data types, right? We have the first one, which are primitive data types. And this is what I'd say is like the most basic building blocks of JavaScript, right? So if I think of building blocks, I think of like the most absolute atomic pieces, right? It can't be broken down into any smaller parts. It's like it's like a literal atom. Like we can't break an atom down into further parts. Like everything is made from an atom and then made from the things that atoms are composed of. So if we have like an atom and then we have a more complex atom and then it gradually we use those building blocks in order to create bigger and more complex things. So we can think of primitive data types in the same way. It's the most small, like atomic building block that we can work with in JavaScript. So it's our foundation. Right, so there's 5 primitive data types in JavaScript. We have number, we have string, Boolean, undefined, and null. Okay, so these are our 5 primitive data types. And then we have our second object data type, which is basically everything else. Okay. So anything that is not any of these 5 primitive data types would be considered an object data type. Okay. So we'll revisit object data types a little later once we get a further understanding of primitive data types. Okay. So then let's start with something that we're kind of all familiar with, which is numbers. So the number data type in JavaScript represents all numbers, right? And the reason why I say all numbers is because some other programming languages differentiate between numbers. We have decimals or integers. However, in JavaScript, all numbers fall into the number data type. Sometimes in other languages, you'll see like if you have any other programming experience, instead of number, like you refer to integer data types as integer, and that has to be differentiated. However, in JavaScript, it's just all in the same bucket. It's all numbers. Right, so these are all numbers. We have 123. We have, it's hard to see, but that's 6 zeros, so that's the number 1 million. We have decimal numbers as well, 500.95. Or if you're thinking of like money, it's like $500.95. We have negative numbers as well, so negative 48, right? So the important thing to note here is that you can't use European style period separators with a comma. So I'm not familiar with European style commas, but I believe this is how, like if they were to write a decimal amount. They actually use commas. So we can't do that in JavaScript. It has to be a period in order to differentiate between our whole numbers and our decimal numbers. And as we saw with the example with the number 1 million, we can't use spaces or commas to make it more readable. We have to scrunch all of our numbers together in order for it to be a valid number. Okay. Remember that a core aspect of programming is dealing with data, right? And one way we can work with data is by performing basic operations on them. So if we think of numbers and basic operations we can perform on numbers, it's simply addition, subtraction. We're manipulating and working with numbers, right? So these are some basic arithmetic operations that we can conduct in JavaScript with numbers. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with most of these. We have addition, so denoted by the plus sign. We have subtraction, which is the dash. Multiplication will be used by an asterisk, which is shift and 8, the number 8. We have division, which is /, and then maybe the operation that some of you won't be familiar with is the remainder operation, which is, actually, let's demonstrate that first. So let's go into Cloud 9 and do some basic mathematical operations. All right, so let's go into our terminal here. And what we're going to do is we're going to type node, N-O-D-E. We're going to hit enter. And what that shows is it'll say, welcome to node.js version, whatever version you've got. And basically this is called the node REPL, or the node REPL, right? And basically this is an interactive playground in JavaScript, and it's a really helpful tool because it shows us the result of our code as soon as we enter it, right? In normal circumstances, and the most common circumstances you'll find is that you are writing a JavaScript file and you don't know the output of your code until you run the file. But here in Node, the moment we enter a line of code and we hit enter, we're going to see the result of that code immediately. Right, so I talked about operations and numbers. So let's do a simple addition operation. Right, so let's take a number, did 7, and then we're going to use the addition operator. And we're going to hit it with another number, provide it with another value, and then I'm going to hit enter. And then we can see on the next line, we received the return value of this operation. We saw what this expression evaluated to, right? 7 plus 5. When we conduct the addition operation using the addition operator and providing with 2 values on either side, we get the result 12. Right? Same thing with, multiplication, forming a multiplication operation, providing it with 2 values, and we get 2 times 0 is 0. 15 minus 5 is 10. 12 divided by 3 is 4. All right, and then the interesting, the remainder operation. So 10 remainder 3 is 1, and that's because we're doing essentially what the remainder operator does is it performs division. So it'll be 10 divided by 3, and then it will give us the remainder of that result. Okay. So when we divide 10 divided by 3, it's we can divide 10 3 times, because 3 times 3 is 9, and then 10 minus 9 is equal to 1. So that's our remainder operator. It's not called modulo. It should not be confused with modulo. There are some subtleties that remainder has that's different from modulo, and there's no actual embedded way within JavaScript in order to calculate modulo. So that's not really anything you need to get into the weeds about now, but just know that there is a difference, and this should be called the remainder operator and not the modulo operator. Okay. So something I'd like to clarify is that I used an interesting term here, right? So first off, what we did was actually, we have the operator, which is syntax that allows us to conduct an operation, right? In this case, it was the addition operator. And what we use to make the operator like execute was we provided it with two values. We provided it with two operands. So this would be called the operator, and this would be called, these values that we provide the operator are called operands. Okay. Another interesting term that I used just now was return value, right? So we typed in an expression, here it's 7 plus 5, and there was an output on the next line. And this is what the expression evaluated to, right? We entered an expression, and 12 was what the expression evaluated to. This is also called the return value. So if I'm asking for the return value of an expression, I'm asking for what the expression evaluates to. Those are interchangeable terms. And basically, it's a bit of a loopy definition, but anything that has a return value is considered an expression. So if I'm entering an expression and evaluates to a value, then it's considered an expression. The interesting thing is that we don't always have to conduct an operation to receive return values. So for example, if I just type in the number 100 and I hit enter, we can see that the return value of 100 is 100, right? Or what the number 100 evaluated to is 100. We don't have to conduct operations in order to receive return values. Any value is technically an expression that evaluates to itself. So that sounds complex, but really it's just saying pretty much all values will just evaluate to themselves. Okay. So that's a quick primer on numbers. Maybe pretty straightforward, but I think it's a good place to start just because it's a mental model most people are familiar with. Why don't we start moving on to strings then? So this is our second primitive data type, remember, out of our 5. We have numbers and now we have strings, right? So if we think about my analogies before, we have words and numbers. So this will be kind of like the word side. We have strings, and strings are the primitive data type in JavaScript that represent text data, right? Because programming often means working with text data such as names, messages, descriptions, right? And we need a primitive data type to hold that type of data or represent that type of data. So that's why we have strings. For those of you coming in from another programming language, in JavaScript, strings are a primitive value type, right? They're not an object. More on that later, but basically what strings are characters in a specific sequence, right? And the way we create strings is by surrounding text with a pair of quotes, double quotes, or backticks. Right? So if I go back into Cloud, if I go back into Cloud 9, so we can create string literals with quotes. So this is a single quote. I'm going to write hello world, which is the classic what every programmer starts off with. And when I hit enter, you can see that the return value of the string that we entered was hello world. And that's because, as I said before, we don't necessarily have to conduct operations in order to get a return value. Values sometimes will just evaluate to themselves. So we entered a string and it evaluated to itself. I can also use double quotes. So welcome to the prep workshops. Oh goodness, I can't type today. And I can also use backticks, which are what's next to my 1 key on my MacBook. So this is also a string, right? So notice I have to use the same string, same like quote that I started with, and I have to close it with the same quote. So if I start with a single quote and I say hello, and I try to end it with a double quote, we get an error, right? I have to use the same type of quote that I started with in order to close the string. So if you ever see an error, don't be alarmed. It doesn't mean that you broke anything or something bad is going to happen. It just means that Node caught an error in your JavaScript code and it will just stop running. It won't run the code, but it doesn't mean we broke anything. So then if we use quotes in order to construct strings, what happens if our text itself requires a quote? So for example, if I write the sentence, I'm excited to be here, I use a single quote and to open the string and to close the string, but I also have a single quote here for the apostrophe, the contraction. So what happens if I hit enter here is that we get an error again. We have uncaught syntax error, unexpected identifier, right? And it's like, okay, what does that mean? Well, what's essentially happening here is, as I showed before, when we're using single quotes, we open and close a string with the single quotes, and JavaScript recognizes those are the ends, that's the start and the end of the string. But when it comes to our next string with the apostrophe in it, what happens is that JavaScript registers the beginning of the string here and the end of the string at the apostrophe. And then, so that's our string. And then if that's where our string ends, JavaScript is looking at the rest of that string and it's going, or the rest of the letters, and it's going, okay, what the heck is that? That's an unexpected identifier. So that's why we're getting that error there. The unexpected identifier error there. So then how do we fix this? Well, if single quotes are being registered here, then we can actually just use double quotes, right? If we use double quotes, then we can signify the beginning and the end of the string with the double quotes, and then the contraction, the apostrophe, can just be recognized as text instead, right? Okay, how about if I need both quotes and double quotes within my string? So I'm going to say, he said, hey, what's up, doc? And then I'm going to use single quotes to close that up. So what happens here? Then, as we expect, we get an error, right? And that's because, again, what happens is the single quotes that we use to open and close a string, instead the apostrophe for the contraction what's up, the apostrophe there is what's going to be recognized as the end of the string that closes the string. So then again, we get the same error because JavaScript is looking at the rest of that and it's saying, okay, what are those letters? If this is the end of the string here, then what are you doing with these letters? Like, that's not syntax I'm familiar with. So then we get that error, right? So following our logic as before, technically I could use the backticks that we mentioned, the symbol that's next to the one key. But actually instead we could use a backticks. That's a viable solution, but I think also this is a good way to demonstrate, this is a good opportunity to demonstrate how to escape characters, right? And basically what escaping characters is we're telling the compiler, we're telling JavaScript that a specific character isn't actually syntax, but it's part of the string itself. So the way we do that is I'm going to write the same string using single quotes and then the double quotes. So he said, hey, what's up, doc? So when we get to the character that we need to escape, what we're going to do is we're going to use the backslash key. And on my MacBook, it's between the delete key and the return key. So it's not the forward slash, but it's the backslash. And then we're going to enter the character that we want to escape. So it's the apostrophe. And then I'm going to continue with the rest of my string. And we can see it didn't throw an error. It worked this time. Yeah, so what happened was that, again, when we use single quotes, JavaScript registered the string end of the string here during the apostrophe. If I were to use double quotes to try and circumvent the situation, then JavaScript would register the end of the string here instead. So then what we do is we escape the character, right? And as I mentioned before, what that backslash simply does is tell JavaScript, like, hey, JavaScript, the next character that I'm about to type out, this apostrophe, that's not syntax. That's actually part of the string that I'm trying to write. Okay. So then JavaScript will interpret, oh, okay, so you're not using that apostrophe as a way to close a string, you're using it as part of the string. So that's what that backslash would do. It's called escaping characters. Okay, so for strings, that's escaping characters. An operation that we can also conduct with strings, speaking of, is we can actually use the plus operator with strings. So if I get the string foo and I use the addition operator and I provide it again with two values, these times it's not going to be two numbers, it's going to be two strings. And if I hit enter, we see the result of that expression. So if I typed in two strings, I wrote foo plus bar, I get a new string returned, which is foo bar, right? So when we're working with the addition operator and strings, we actually call it concatenation. So the addition of two strings, period. So we're saying that we concatenated the values. Right, so if I write hello plus world, I hit enter, I get hello world, and you'll notice that we get the exact concatenation of those strings. Notice that I didn't have a space in those strings, so the resulting word, the resulting addition, also does not have a space. If I want that space to be in there, I'm going to have to type in the space either in either string, or I do a third string, which is just the space, and I concatenate all three of those strings, right? Again, notice that I used a capital H there, and this is 100% case sensitive. So if I really start warping things around, we're going to get the exact literal interpretation, the exact same addition as the string that we entered it. Okay. How about if we had numbers within our strings, right? What's the result of the string 1 plus the string 2? And you might be able to sneak a little preview there that the Cloud9 services is showing me, but the answer is not 3, as we would expect with a number operation, but in fact is the string 12, right? So recall that if they are numbers, they're not enclosed in the quotes that create strings, then we get a numerical addition operation. However, if we have any values between quotations, which makes them into a string, whenever you use the addition operation with strings, it's not a numerical addition operation, it's a concatenation, right? So it's appending them together. So we get not the mathematical operation here, but instead the attach of the concatenation of two strings instead. Okay, so then what happens if I were to try actually before that, what would happen if I try subtracting a string from a string? So if I were to try and subtract the letter I, the character I from the string hi, we should reasonably enough get just the h, right? And the answer is no. The twist is that that's not exactly how it works. So the only real operation that we can conduct with strings, with a couple exceptions, but basically one of the main operations that we can conduct with strings are concatenation. However, subtraction is a mathematical operation. It's not a string viable operation. So what actually this is a result is what NaN is not a number. Stands for not a number, right? And not a number basically means we try to conduct a mathematical operations with values that are not numbers. So what happens is that the result is not a number, right? I can't subtract. Mathematically, I can't subtract I from hi, right? So unfortunately, there's no real way to manipulate strings in that way. So just know that for the operators that we've been shown for our arithmetic operations, those aren't valid with strings. In fact, when we do addition with strings, it's not even technically addition. Again, it's concatenation, right? So concatenation is available for strings. However, none of the other operators work for strings. So then what happens if I were to start mixing it up? Like, what if I do the number 1 and then I try and add it to the string 2, right? Okay, so it looks like JavaScript silently changed the number 1 to the string 1 and did the operation for me. Okay, that's kind of sus, that's kind of weird. What if I did the string 5 subtracted by the number 3, right? Like we shouldn't be able to do any string operations. So maybe I'm gonna get that NaN value again, but again, for some reason, when I did that operation, JavaScript seemed to have silently changed the number 5 to the string 5. JavaScript seems to have changed the string 5 to the number 5 without telling me. Or, you know, I shouldn't be able to subtract strings. So if I do the string 10 minus the string 6, again, for some reason that worked. JavaScript seems to have changed both of those values to numbers and then did the mathematical operation that I said was supposedly not possible with strings. And the reason for all of this is because JavaScript is actually really infamous for its peculiarity and how it silently changes or coerces. When we talk about changing a data type from changing a value from one data type to another, we call it coercing or changing, or in some other languages, we call it casting. So JavaScript is particularly infamous for this peculiarity. It's silent. It doesn't tell you there's an error. It doesn't tell you you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing. It just kind of does it without telling you. So I'm going to say that the takeaway here is that you're not expected to memorize this behavior. You're not expected to memorize like, oh, okay, so if I do a number and I add a number and a string, JavaScript's going to change it into a string. Like you're not expected to 100% memorize that because it's just so nuanced in the way that it works. But you're expected to know that JavaScript will do that, right? So it's in your best interest to be working in the same data types as much as possible and not to be counting on this behavior because it can be unexpected. One way that we can explicitly change data types ourselves. So let's say for that first operation, I didn't want it to be the string 12. I wanted it to be the number 3. So what happens there is I can explicitly direct the change myself by using, let's use the number function. So I'm going to type the word number with capital letters, just a capital N, and then we do an open parentheses and a closing parentheses. And then in between the parentheses, we write the value that we want to explicitly coerce or change into a number. So this time it's the string 2 and I want it to be explicitly coerced to the number 2 so that I get the addition operation. And you can see that instead of the string 1, 2 operation that we got, I didn't get concatenation, I got numerical addition, right? Again, if I, and I can do the same with, let's do the same one, except this time I do want the explicit concatenation. So then I can use the string function, so capital S string, again, parentheses, and then I put in the value that I want to change to a string in between, plus the string. Some of you may be asking, but okay, but like you didn't have to write the string because we saw from 1 plus string 2 that it's going to JavaScript, like we already know that JavaScript's going to change the 1 into a string. So like you didn't have to write the string. And I'm going to say it's best to not count on the behavior. Again, don't rely on this behavior. Be explicit. Know what you're working with, and don't let JavaScript change things silently for you because it leads to so many unexpected bugs and things, bugs and unexpected behaviors that you don't want to count on and are also very difficult to debug. Okay. So that's strings and numbers for you. I'm just going to check. There's a quick question here, and then we will move on regarding concatenation of strings. We can also demonstrate that string and integers concatenate. So, right, exactly. So, as I've demonstrated here, when we try and concatenate a string and a number, what happens is that it's not necessarily concatenating the number. What happens is that JavaScript is silently changing it into a string and then concatenating the strings. Because technically you cannot concatenate a number and a string. You can only concatenate strings together. But what's happening there is that JavaScript is silently changing the number to a string and then performing the concatenation. Okay. Okay, awesome. So just to make sure everyone's been following along, I have a very short quiz. So regarding quizzes, I do start them off easy just to do a quick review of what we've touched on so far. But my ultimate purpose is also to stump you with these quizzes. So don't be discouraged if you don't get it right away. These quizzes, I think people learn the best when they're burned by a mistake. When you're wrong about something, like you remember it a lot better than, you know, if you just read it and you're like, oh, okay, like I understand that. But if you're burned by mistake because you're like, oh, but I thought it was that, like you're more likely to remember it. So my ultimate goal with these quizzes is to make you get burned by mistake. So don't be discouraged if you don't get some of these questions right. Let's start easy. So what is the return value of this expression? Right, so what is the return value of this expression? We're doing, it looks like we're doing some arithmetic operations. So we know that the plus is the addition operation. So we're doing 5 plus 4, which is 9. And actually, I didn't go over this, but just like arithmetics in real life and programming as well, brackets signify a precedence, right? This operation should be conducted first before moving on to the next operation. So we do 5 plus 4, which is 9. And then this slash, remember, is the division operation. So we get 9 divided by 3, and our final result is 3. Right? The return value of this expression is 3. So what is the return value of this expression then? What is the return value of this expression? I'm going to give it 15 more seconds. Okay. I'm going to go over this really quickly. So, and by go over this really quickly, I'm just literally going to type it in Node and see what happens. So I'm going to type, we have just the word hello. I type in the word hello and I hit enter. And what we get is an uncaught reference error, right? So the answer is the code produces an error. And that's because it's not a string. We haven't enclosed it in any type of quotes or or double quotes or backticks in order to signify to JavaScript that this is a string. So the answer is it's an error. Some of you may have answered undefined, which means it doesn't have a return value, or simply, actually, excuse me, it means that the return value of this line is undefined, but that wouldn't be true either, because what happened was that the code produced an error before we could even receive a return value, even if that return value is undefined. So undefined isn't correct here either. The string hello isn't correct here either. The correct answer is that this code produces an error, right? Recall that when JavaScript, when we throw an error, when an error is produced in JavaScript code, the code stops running. So we aren't even able to achieve a return value here, right? So remember that for strings, they have to be within the quotes or the double quotes or the backticks in order for them to be strings. So what this specific error actually means is that, so it says uncaught reference error, hello is not defined. So because we didn't enclose it in any symbols that would denote it as a string, what happens is that JavaScript thinks we're using a variable. And if you don't understand, that's totally fine, but we'll be touching on that potentially later. But basically it's saying like, oh, like you're trying to use a variable, but you don't even define the variable. And that's why we're getting that uncaught reference error. Okay. Tricky one. The little details are important. Okay, so what is the return value of this expression? So what is the return value of this expression? Let me quickly just hit it in Node and see what happens. So I'm going to use the double quotes to construct the string 500. And then I'm using the addition operator. And then I'm going to use the backticks to construct the second string 22. And if I hit enter, we get a concatenated 50022 string, right? The answer is not this code produces an error, because even though we use different methods or different characters to construct the string, so we use the backticks in one and double quotes in the other, both of them are still valid strings. And therefore, as long as they are strings, we can conduct the concatenation operation and it shouldn't throw an error. So the last one is the correct answer there. Right, so, oops. What is the return value of this expression? Right, so the return value of this expression, right, so this is an easy one. So we're just doing the string plus the string 100. And even though there's numbers there and there's letters here, they're both strings, and that means concatenation. And that means we get the new string 100, right? Okay, last one for this quiz, and then we'll move on. What is the return value of this expression? What is the return value of this expression here? 5 more seconds, I'll give it. Okay, awesome. Let's go through this one. So we have the string, and then we're using the subtraction operator, and we provide it with two values, which are strings. So I have the string, and I also have the string ing. And when I hit enter, we get NaN. Remember, that stands for not a number. It means that we tried to do a mathematical operation on that resulted in invalid value that's not a number. So many of you answered this code produces an error. So you knew that we can't do mathematical operations with two strings because this subtraction operation is only available to numbers. So you knew that. However, maybe perhaps in other programming languages, this would throw an error. It would be like, you're trying to subtract two things that are not numbers. But in JavaScript, again, it's a little nuanced that way, and where it won't throw an error at you. It won't stop running your code. It'll just say, okay, like you're trying to do a mathematical operation and it's not a number. So it'll just return not a number. When there's a distinct difference between NaN and the code producing error. If the code produces an error, the code stops running and it terminates your program. And it's a big deal. It crashes your program essentially. Whereas if it's returning the value NaN or undefined, that's not terminating your program. Your program is actually still running. It just means the return value is a very specific value. So the correct answer here is not a number, right? We're doing an invalid operation between two values that are not numbers. Okay. Okay, awesome. Any questions so far? Feel free to use Q&A. Feeling pretty good here so far? Okay. So the next few data types still run through pretty quickly. So I think string and numbers are the most complex ones. Let's move on to Boolean values. So Boolean, Boolean values represent on or off states, right? We have strings, numbers, and now we have Booleans, the third one. Booleans represent on or off states, and similar to how a light switch is just on or off, there's no in between, or there shouldn't be. We have true or false. Those are the two Boolean values, true or false. So Boolean values play especially an important role when we're working with comparison operators, right? So what are comparison operators then? So if before we had arithmetic operations, now we have comparison operations. So we have the greater than operator, less than operator, the greater than or equal to operator, less than or equal to operator, and actually greater than. And then we also have the equal to. This is the strict equality operator. Okay. So it pretty much works as you'd expect, right? Is 100 greater than 1? It's true, right? Is 100 less than 1? That's not true, right? 100 is greater than 1. So then if I do, is 100 less than 1? It's false. Is 100 greater than or equal to 100? And 100 is equal, right? It's not greater than 100, but it is equal to 100, so we get true. And is 1 equal to 1? That's true. Is 1 equal to 100? That's false, right? Comparison operators, we're getting, is it right or wrong? Is it true or false, right? I can also conduct, I'm going to do strict equality with two strings, right? Is the string high equal to the string high? How about if I had a capital letter in 1, right? Is the string high equal to the string high with a capital H? And the answer is false because it's case sensitive. They're not the same string, right? What happens if I do a equality operation on string 3 and the number 3, right? As we've come to this theme, the string 3 and the number 3 are a very different thing, right? So we're getting false here as well. What happens if we compare strings with using the greater than operator? So is the string 2 greater than the string 100, right? We know mathematically that 2 is not greater than 100, but we're not talking mathematics here, right? We're talking strings. So why is this true? Why is the string 2 greater than the string 100? And that is because when we conduct comparisons with number strings, right? What happens is that JavaScript will actually go from character to character and do a character by character comparison first. So the first character is 2 and 1, right? And 2 is indeed greater than 1, right? Mathematically speaking, 2 is greater than 1. So then that's why we get true, right? So what about, is 51 less than 5,000? Again, mathematically, we do know that 51 is a smaller number than 5,000, but again, we get false here. And that's because we're doing a character by character comparison. So we compare the first characters, 5 and 5, and those are the same numbers. So then we'll move on to the next character instead, which is 1 and 0. And we know that 1 is greater than 0. So when we ask this ourselves, is 1 less than 0? We get false, which means this evaluates to false. Right? So Boolean values, just true and false. And then lastly, we have our last two values. We have undefined and null, right? And basically undefined and null, I'm grouping them together because they both express the absence of a value, right? The difference between the two, and you won't really run into this too much in the core curriculum, is, sorry, not the core, you'll definitely run into the core curriculum, but you won't run into it much in 101 and 109. The difference between the two is that null must be used explicitly, whereas undefined can arise implicitly. Okay. Undefined and null. So null must be used explicitly, undefined can arise implicitly. So what that means is that if you want to see the value null in your code, you have to write null. Like I have to write null in order for it to appear. Undefined, it can appear even though you don't write it. That's what it basically means. Let's say, I don't know, for example, I write, well, you'll see some examples later on, but if I'm making a variable declaration, for example, and you don't need to understand what this code means, I'm just trying to show an example of how I didn't write the word undefined, but somehow it'll appear. I'm going to write a variable declaration. And when I hit enter, you're going to see that the return value of this declaration was undefined. So I didn't write the word undefined anywhere, but for some reason it arose implicitly. And that's the chief difference between null and undefined. If I want to use null, I have to write it out. If somehow, in a lot of situations, as we'll see in the future, undefined can just arise even though you didn't write it. Okay. I usually get a lot of questions about this, but at this point, this is all you really need to know about null, especially. Okay. I have a short quiz on this, but I don't think honestly it's worth going through. I do want to get into arrays and objects really quickly, and then open the floor up for questions. Okay. So I think we'll end up going maybe about 5 minutes over. So I do apologize for the time. If you do have to leave on the dot in 4 minutes, that's totally fine. I respect everyone's time for sure. So let's blast through arrays and objects, and then I'll open the floor to questions. So we talked about our 5 primitive data types. So we had number, we have string, we have Boolean, the true or false values, and now we have undefined and null. Those are our 5 primitive values. So recall at the very beginning of our lecture, I said that there are 2 data types. So we have the primitive data types, which are the 5 that we talked about just now, and anything that's not these 5 primitive data types is considered an object data type. It's everything else in JavaScript. So then this next section will be working with arrays and objects, and therefore, because they're not either any of the primitive data types, that means these are object data types, right? So what is an array? An array is a way to organize information into an ordered list, right? We basically construct an array by using a pair of square brackets, one to open the array and one to close the array. And then we separate all the values we want within it with a comma, right? So just like any other list, if I'm writing like a grocery list, like a sentence, and I'm going to write, okay, I'm going to need apples, bananas, oranges. What we do is we separate each word with a comma, right? I'm creating a list of things that I want. Important thing to know about arrays is that we can actually contain any values of any data types within our array. So let's actually just try making a couple of arrays first, just for demonstration. So like I said, we're creating an ordered list of values within a set of square brackets. So I'm going to open the square bracket first. I'm going to write some numbers. I'm going to write a list of numbers, and I'm going to separate them by commas, right? That's how we differentiate between each value. And then I'm going to close the array with the closing bracket. If I hit enter, we can see that we have our array of numbers, right? And like I said before, it doesn't necessarily just have to be numbers. Here I did an array of only numbers, but like I said, it's heterogeneous. It can be any type of data types in there, right? That's valid. So then how do I go on about, like, what can I do with this array? How do I go on about accessing the values in the array, right? And so the important thing to know about arrays is that each element within the array has an index, right? This index corresponds to where in the array the value is positioned in. So the very first one, our very first element in our array is the string ace. And then the next one is king, queen, jack. So this is the first element, this is the second element, this is the third, and this is the fourth. However, if we want to access any of these elements, what we actually have to do is access their index. And the interesting thing about indexes or indices in arrays is that it's zero index. It starts from 0. So if I want to access the string king, what I actually have to do is access index number 1. So let's construct that array, right? And I'm going to hit enter. And then, so if I want to access the string queen, let's do that. Let's do the string queen. What I can actually do with Node is I can hit up, and what it'll do is bring up the last piece of code that I entered, so I don't have to write out the entire array again. So recall that again, I want to access queen, which is at index number 2. So then what I do there is I create, after the array that I constructed, I'm going to write another set of square brackets and the index that I want to access within it, right? And that's how I get the string queen, the third value, right? Again, if I wanted to access ace, it would have to be index 0, king for index 1, and for jack, index number 3. So then what happens if I try to access an index that's not defined in our array? I don't have a fifth element. I don't have an item at index 4. So what happens if I try to access index number 4? When I hit enter, I get undefined, right? As I said before, the difference between undefined and null is that null can just arise implicitly, even though I don't see the word undefined in this array anywhere. Whereas null, I actually have to explicitly write null for it to appear somewhere, right? So this is an example of how undefined arose implicitly. And remember, undefined and null both represent the absence of a value. So basically what it's saying is that you don't have an element at index number 4. Right, so chiefly what we have to remember is that the order of elements in an array is important because then it affects what index that they're assigned, right? So remember, an array can be considered an ordered list, an ordered data structure. Really important. And then lastly, we have objects, right? So objects are similar to arrays in that they are a collection. They're a list, except instead of it being an ordered list, it's a list of key value pairs, right? We use curly braces to construct an object instead of the square braces. And we separate the key value pairs with commas, right? The key is always going to be a string, and the key is always going to be a string, no matter how we try to go on about it. It always has to be a string, and no matter what value we put into it as keys, JavaScript will coerce it into a string. So no matter what, keys are strings. The value can be a value of any data type. So I might have lost some of you when I said key value pairs, because it's like, okay, like what does that mean? And basically, instead of indexes, what we have are key value pairs. So I like to think of it as a dictionary, right? When you open the dictionary, you have the word and the definition. So you can think of the key as the word and the value as the definition. So if I'm, let's create our object first, and I'll demonstrate. So instead of the square brackets, we're using the curly braces, right? So I'm going to write dog barks, and then I'm going to write cat meows and pig oinks. So basically I've created an object with animals and their respective noises that they make. And so this is an example of a key value pair. So remember, going back to my dictionary analogy, we have the word dog, and what does it evaluate to? It evaluates to the value barks, right? So this is the key, and this is its respective value. So this is a key value pair because they're together. The dog is equal to, not equal to, but the key dog evaluates to the value barks. The key cat evaluates to the value meows, and so on and so forth, right? So again, there's our object. These are our keys. And again, I didn't enclose them in any strings or any quotes or double quotes or backticks, but JavaScript will always make it a string. So these are actually strings, even though they don't have any quotes around them. And then remember, we have the values, which can be of any type, but in this case, I've made them into a string. And then each pair, because they're separated by the commas, is called a key value pair, right? And the way we access values in an object is very similar to how we access values in an array, which is we're going to use the set of square brackets at the end. And then we're going to write the key of the value that we want to access. So if I want to access the key meows, then rather than indexes or indices, I have to write cat. But remember that cat is a string. Even though there's no quotes here, keys are always going to be strings. So I have to make sure when I'm trying to get the value meows that I enclose the word cat in strings. And when I hit enter, we get meows. Similar to the last example, if I try to look for a key in the object that doesn't exist, that we haven't defined, then we get the primitive value undefined. Okay. So super quick run through on objects and arrays. Really short quiz, and then I think that's about it for today. I'm gonna have to wrap up. We couldn't get to variables, but I will stick around for any questions. So quiz number 1. How do we access the string Trevor from this array? Okay, cool. So really quick, I'm gonna construct the string, or construct the array, pardon me. So I've constructed the array, and we're trying to access Trevor. Remember that for an array that we're using indices. So I know it starts at 0 index. So we're going to go 0 and 1. So Trevor is at index number 1. Indices are numbers. They're not strings. So I just have to keep it as a number. And I get the string Trevor. What actually happens if I try to access a string is that JavaScript actually coerced it. Okay, I didn't know that. I was going to say it was going to return undefined, but today I learned something new. Okay, so I guess both answers are correct. So yeah. So we can use the string index number 1. But what is actually happening here is that JavaScript is coercing it to the number 1. So honestly, you really shouldn't be typing it out like this. I would say that's like pretty bad practice because people are going to be confused at what you're trying to do. So today I eat my words, but in saying that this is wrong, but try and stick to the actual numbers. I learned something new about this language, even though like I've been doing this for so long. Okay, what's the return value of this expression? What is the return value of this expression? And pretty much everyone's gone. It's undefined, right? Because I'm trying to access the element at index number 5, but as we know, if it's 0 indexed, arrays and arrays are 0 indexed, it starts at 0, index number 1, index number 2, index number 3. We don't even have an index number 4, let alone index number 5, so we get undefined. Nice. Okay, last question for you folks. Thanks so much for sticking through. How do we access the string hello from this object? Okay, I'm gonna go through this one. So we have this object, which has the key value pairs foo and 15 and bar and hello, right? And I want the string hello. So remember that for objects instead of indices, so we can't use numbers because they're not assigned indexes, so we can't use numbers here. So it's not that even if we try and use index number 1 because bar is the second one that we have defined here, it actually won't work. So instead what we have to do is we have to access the key bar, right? Because the string hello is the value of the key bar. So then we have to put the key here, but remember that keys are always strings, so that we have to enclose it, the word bar in quotations, because if we don't, and we try and running that, we actually get an error because again, JavaScript thinks that we're trying to use a variable that we haven't defined here because we didn't enclose it in strings. So make sure you're enclosing that in strings there. Okay, so the correct answer is the second one. Okay. Awesome. Okay. I do apologize that we couldn't get to variables, but thank you so much for attending. I hope you're able to take something out of this. I'm hoping that was a more engaging learning experience for you, and I'm hoping that you got to test your knowledge, test your understanding, but also maybe see where your gaps in understanding are and to have an opportunity to work through those. If you're joining me next week at the same time, I'm doing functions, variables, and variable scope. which I think is super important, right? Like understanding how functions work. I've actually seen like other streamers. I watch like coding streams sometimes. I've watched like other streamers and I've watched like other boot camps. I've seen students from those boot camps and those online streams that have no idea how functions work, and they're working with like frameworks like React, and I'm just like astounded with how like they don't understand how basic functions work, and they're working with these big frameworks. So I just think like functions especially are so imperative. Functions and variable scope. All of launch school is really important, but functions definitely important. So thanks so much for attending. I'll be sticking around for any questions. They can be related to what we covered today, but they can also just be anything that you've encountered in the curriculum so far, or any snippets of code you've encountered so far. So yeah, feel free to ask. And yes, it'll be next Tuesday as well as 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time Zone. You should be getting the emails for the registration links. But otherwise, and if you haven't already, definitely join the Launch School Slack channel, because community is there. The links are all there. It's much easier to get in touch with everyone there, and I'm always there if you want to ask a question as well. Oh yeah, and please, if you can, fill out the feedback form, just because it lets us know what's working with these sessions and what isn't. So we're constantly trying to improve on them. So your feedback is really helpful for us. It's like a 2-minute survey that I've posted up there. But yeah, I'll stick around. But otherwise, if you have places to be, or if you've got to go to bed because it's a little later, feel free to drop off. It was good meeting you all. E-meeting everyone. Yeah, any questions regarding curriculum or not curriculum, TAing, like anything, the floor is open. Okay, so interesting question. Can I say that the less than and the greater than operator short circuit when comparing string values containing numbers, because it looks like it stops comparing and returns a value as soon as one of the strings runs out of characters? Okay, interesting question. I guess like just looking at the way that it works, it looks like short circuiting. Let me get the example. But I wouldn't say short circuiting, because it doesn't stop. It stops comparing when it reaches an answer, which is that 2 here is greater than 1. So it doesn't need to even move on to the next one in order to evaluate it, because it already knows the string is greater than this one, right? So it's not that the string ran out of characters to compare. What happened is that JavaScript was able to decide which is greater, and in this case it was the 2. So I wouldn't say short circuit. I think the term short circuiting, especially if you're looking at it from a written assessment perspective, is talking about ternary operators and pardon me, not ternary operators. It's looking at the and or operators, in which, and if you're new to today's sessions, don't worry if you don't know about this. We're looking at operations where it's like truthy and falsy values. So 5 or hello, right? So if technically this should throw an error, right? Because hello here is not a string and I haven't defined the variable hello. But what happened was that for the or operator is that only one of the 2 have to be truthy. And because 5 is truthy, it will short circuit here and JavaScript will not even run this code, the second part of the code. That's what I would call short circuiting. And I would reserve that term for this case only. I would not use that term here. Because this is not really an example of short circuiting. It's just how the comparison works, right? I would say like if you're thinking about like how to describe it in assessment terms, it would be to say that it would be to say for string comparisons, for comparison operations conducted with string operands, JavaScript will perform a character by character comparison from left to right, rather than to say short circuiting. I hope that answers your question. So why does it matter if the error is undefined, NaN, or error message? Really good question. So it matters because when we get an error, what happens is that the program actually stops running. So what happens here is that in our node REPL playground, what's happening is that because it's just a playground, an interactive playground, it doesn't shut down everything. It just tells you that there's an error. But if you were to write a JavaScript file, which is usually how people use JavaScript, like you don't ever really like code an entire program in the interactive playground. The interactive playground is more of a tool just to see your instant results. But what happens usually is that people are coding JavaScript by creating JavaScript files. So I'm just going to demonstrate here. I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to name it, going to rename it myfile.js, right? We write .js so that it's a JavaScript file. And what happens is that usually what we will write code, JavaScript code in this file. So I'm going to write, what should I write? Okay, so I'm going to write console.log, which is a method in JavaScript that lets us see what's coming out in what our code is doing. It's going to print whatever I write in between the brackets into our terminal, okay? Because if I just write the string hello, what happens is that I have to save the file and I run the file. I write node and I write the name of the file. This is called running a JavaScript file. And you'll see that nothing happens. And that's because JavaScript ran this file, it created the string hello. But remember, unlike the node REPL, when we're just running files in JavaScript, we don't see the instant results. Whereas like if I went into node here and I wrote hello, immediately I see the result. The return value is hello. So I'm just going to type .exit to get out of the playground again. So if I want to see what JavaScript is doing, then I have to wrap it around the words console.log, and then the parentheses, I have to write what I want printed to the terminal in between. So right now I'm telling JavaScript, hey JavaScript, I have this string hello, can you print it to the terminal for me? And then when I write node in myfile.js, which is how I'm going to run the file, JavaScript will print out hello, right? So the reason why, so undefined and nan are actually not errors. They're values that are being returned by JavaScript. So if I write undefined, or if I write, console.log nan in my file, so I'm telling JavaScript, hey, can you show me, can you print out undefined and nan for me within my terminal? And then I'm going to save the changes to the file. And then I'm going to run the file, and we can see that JavaScript printed out undefined and nan. Like that works, right? That's not an error. Those are just values that JavaScript can print. And those are values that we can work with in JavaScript. However, I'm going to purposely make an error. So remember before when I wrote the word hello without the strings, without the quotes around it, what happened was that JavaScript said, oh no, there's an error here. Like you can't do that. So what happens if there's an error in my file? So I'm going to purposely write the word hello without the strings again. And then I'm going to save the file. I'm going to run the file. When you run the file, this is what an error looks like. It looks kind of like scary, I guess. We can see that we ran the file, and then it shows the path of the file that we created, and it says :1, which is the line number in which the error is happening. And it points to the word hello, and it says hello is not defined. This is an error. And when, as I mentioned before, when errors occur, the program stops running. So it didn't even get to line numbers 2 and 3. So we don't even see undefined and nan output anywhere here. And that's because the file crashed. It didn't proceed. So the difference between errors is that if there's an error in your code, your program won't stop running. It won't work. Whereas if I type out things like undefined and nan, it's not an error. It's just a value that I'm outputting to the terminal. So this works. Like if I was working with undefined and nan in my code, like it won't break the code. But if I have an error and I don't handle the error, it will break the code. Right? So for today's lesson, it's just important to know what the different data types are, but you'll definitely encounter what errors look like and the differences between them more as you keep working through the course. At this stage, I'm going to say that don't think of undefined as an error or nan as an error. I would say just think of it as values. So similar to how like 5 + 1 returns 6. Sometimes like accessing certain things returns undefined. Trying to subtract 2 strings is equal to nan, right? Like try and think of it as like the result of an operation rather than an error, because to call these errors would be technically incorrect. An error would be something that terminates your code, like gives you a message like this. Okay. I hope that answers your question. It's a little complicated right now, I'd say, but yeah. Cool. Thanks for asking. That was a really good question, I think. Okay. Any other questions for today? I think that's about it. Yeah, thanks so much for attending, everybody. Fill out the feedback form if you haven't, and if you'll be joining me next week, then I'll be seeing you next week. Have a great rest of your evening and your day, and hope to see you around. Good luck with the learning. Thank you. All right, peace out, everybody.